my mission is to let people know that, again, the seeds are sown for brain degeneration 2, 3, 4 decades in advance. And here's what you need to be doing right now to keep brain metabolism where it needs to be, and therefore dramatically lower your risk for this disease, for which, did I mention, there is no meaningful treatment.
Dr. David Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist, a 6-time New York Times bestselling author. He serves on the board of directors and is a fellow of the American College of Nutrition and currently serves as the director of neuroscience research by Bryan Therapeutics. Dr. Perlmutter received his MD degree from the University of Miami School of Medicine, where he was awarded the Leonard Rountree Research Award. He serves as a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease and has published extensively in peer-reviewed scientific journals, including Archives of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and the Journal of Applied Nutrition. In addition, he is a frequent lecturer at symposia sponsored by institutions such as the World Bank and IFM, Columbia University, Scripps Institute, New York University, and Howard University. Dr. Perlmutter's books have been published into 32 languages and include the #1 New York Times bestseller, Grain Brain: The Surprising Truth About Wheat, Carbs, and Sugar, with over 1 million copies in print. His other New York Times bestsellers include Brain Maker, The Grain Brain Cookbook, The Grain Brain Whole Life Plan, and Brainwash, co-written by Austin Perlmutter, MD, who happens to be his son. His latest New York Times best-selling book, Drop Acid, focuses on the pivotal role of uric acid in metabolic disease. Welcome, Dr. Perlmutter. I'm so excited to have you on Take Back Your Health with Dr. Amy Myers. Welcome, Dr. Perlmutter. So great to have you on Take Back Your Health. Dr. Amy Myers, great to see you. I haven't seen you in forever.
It's been a long time, that's for sure. Good to see you too.
All right. Well, let's jump straight into it. You are considered the empowering neurologist. When I first met you, you were doing an extensive work with both Alzheimer's, but also with Parkinson's. And if somebody Googled you or got onto YouTube, they would see these incredible videos of you working with Parkinson's patients who are stuttering, unable to walk. You give them a IV glutathione and, they appear, at least online, as almost virtually recovered. Can you, kind of walk us through what you were doing, what's happening there, how this glutathione was working?
The reason we chose to do glutathione injections on Parkinson's is we've learned that the Parkinson's is basically a manifestation of the dropout of certain cells in the brain that make a chemical that everyone's familiar with called dopamine. But the treatment of Parkinson's remains to this day symptomatic, means that various drugs are used to mimic dopamine or to give back dopamine as an attempt to help patients with their symptoms. There's really no treatment for the underlying Parkinson's that even is available as you and I have this conversation. It's much the same, for example, with diabetes. There is no medication to treat diabetes. The medications that are used will certainly lower the blood sugar, but the moment you stop taking the pill or the injection, guess what? Your blood sugar goes right back up, as it is with Parkinson's. The moment you stop taking your drugs that mimic dopamine, your symptoms return, or you turn off your deep brain stimulator, whatever it is. So what's happening is that in an area of the brain called the substantia nigra, there are dopaminergic neurons that use dopamine as a neurotransmitter, and they begin to fail and they ultimately begin to die, and in fact do die off. That is the underlying straightforward pathology that is the cause of Parkinson's, and that really laid the groundwork for the development of the drugs I just described. But again, to me, it was interesting to focus on the smoke, but I wanted to focus on the fire. I wanted to find out what the heck's going on in the brain. Why are these neurons degenerating? And the literature at the time was looking at the mitochondria of those neurons, finding that there were mitochondrial defects. So therefore, the neurons were ultimately failing because their mitochondria weren't working. And so in many ways, we would then consider Parkinson's, like Alzheimer's, to be an acquired mitochondrial-based disease. And at the same time, we began to identify that there were enzymes in Parkinson's that were deficient. And these enzymes had to do with detoxification of things that we were exposed to in our environment. And, again, there's a long list of issues that relate to Parkinson's risk in terms of being exposed. But that said, one important enzyme was based on glutathione. And I thought, here's glutathione, an important mitochondrial protector and also involved in detoxification. Why don't we just give it and see what happens? And I'm not bold enough to think I could do that. I went, of course, to the literature and learned that there was a doctor in Italy named Dr. Secchi who was actually doing that and getting great results. So at that point, I said, okay, we'll do this in Florida as well. And to my satisfaction and yes, surprise, we saw some amazing results early on. Began to post those. I began to include those videos that you mentioned in my lectures. People got kind of lit up about this, both in alternative integrative functional medicine being excited, and the mainstream wasn't so pleased because, it was kind of like, we'll give them the drugs, end of story. And so I did what you would expect. We worked with a major university and conducted a well-developed double-blind placebo trial at the University of South Florida with a Dr. Robert Hauser, published it in the journal Movement Disorders, and validated that, in fact, some really good things were happening by giving patients glutathione, by improving their ability to detoxify, by enhancing how their mitochondria work, and preserving the ability of brain cells to make dopamine. So that was very fascinating back in those days. We know that people are still using intravenous glutathione. And my hope is that we, really remain focused on the underlying disease. Yes, it's great to have symptomatic medications available to help people with their rigidity and their tremors. I get that. But let's not lose sight of targeting the underlying problem. There's a great quote from Desmond Tutu, and he said something along the lines of, I'm going to paraphrase, yes, it's important to pull people out of the river, but we need to find out why they're falling in the first place. In other words, what's going on to cause these problems? And I think we know very well that what's causing the dropout of these neurons that make dopamine is damage from chemicals. There are other causes of Parkinson's. There's what's called pugilistic Parkinson's, where if you have multiple hits to the head, you can damage the substantia nigra. Muhammad Ali had that. But by and large, I think most would agree that exposure to chemicals in the environment sets the stage in people who are genetically predisposed for the development of damage to this area of the brain that makes the dopamine. So having said that, job one would be to limit the exposure. Job one also, I think I'm not going to underrate the value of enhancing detoxification, really very, very important. As a matter of fact, in 1983, we learned of research that revealed that people in around San Francisco, a group of individuals who were using a synthetic form of Demerol that was made in somebody's garage, I guess, had developed Parkinson's. It was called MPTP. And what happened was this research, when these people came into the hospital, the resident who admitted these patients contacted the head of his department, Dr. Langston. They studied these individuals and realized that they were exposed to a powerful toxin that immediately went right to that area of the brain and immediately caused Parkinson's. MPTP, meperidine or Demerol kind of analog that was an illicit drug. So these researchers not only tried to recreate the drug, but actually went to the supplier of the drug, the illicit drug in San Francisco, and found it and got some of the drug and said, look, we're not the police. We just want the drug for research purposes. They got it. And they used that drug to create Parkinson's in primates. And it became a very powerful tool to study exactly how it is that those neurons in that part of the brain are damaged, and really enhanced research dramatically because you could cause that damage to happen immediately. And then you could look at ways of protecting the brain and other types of interventions. So again, a very strong relationship to the role of toxins and the failure of detoxification to produce this disease. And in fact, in the 4th century BC, it was described by the Yellow Emperor Neijing in China that this is really a detoxification. He pointed to the liver, which is, as we now know, the body's core for detoxification as being central to this disease. And that was affirmed by Galen in the 2nd century AD, who said that this is a disease of black bile. And that again points to the liver. And incredibly, now we have identified a series of enzymes involved in liver detoxification that are deficient in patients with Parkinson's, like glutathione S transferase type M1. So incredible how, this history unfolds. James Parkinson, in his 1817 description of the disease that bears his name, did not speculate in terms of what was the underlying cause, but really thought that it would be valuable to explore ways of identifying what is going on that is causing the disease, and therefore treat it preemptively in ways beyond simply treating the symptoms. I actually have a copy of his original treatise, the Essay on the Shaking Palsy. Can't remember where I got this, but it's incredible to read this when there was no treatment, no understanding of the disease, and yet, just an incredibly eloquent description of what we see today in terms of these individuals.
Well, I definitely want to dive deeper into some specifics in terms of, toxins that can predispose you or set you towards Parkinson's. Before we get there, it's kind of interesting. I always call glutathione, one of our master detoxifiers. And so the fact that, you're seeing that it is sort of a deficiency in glutathione or an overload of toxins that is creating this situation. Back to the IV glutathione, glutathione, particularly IV, has a very short half-life. So my question is, how long were you seeing the positive effects? And were there other things that you were doing when people were not coming into your clinic? Were you either giving them oral glutathione in the meantime, giving them the precursors to glutathione? What were you doing to help? Because
there has not been a really powerful way of giving glutathione via the oral route that allows it to maintain its integrity as a tripeptide and therefore survive what goes on in the stomach in terms of breaking down the peptides. And so what you alluded to, I think, is right on target. And that is, then that said, what can you do to enhance not only the production of glutathione in the body, but actually preserve it as well, so that it is available to participate in the various actions in which it's involved, most of which deal with preserving function of the mitochondria, but detoxification as well. So alpha lipoic acid is certainly one player, a couple 100 milligrams a day. That does tend to preserve glutathione in its reduced, non-oxidized state, meaning that it's available to act as a quencher, if you will, of free radicals. N-acetylcysteine as a cysteine precursor has also shown to be effective in affecting glutathione levels in the body. And I think the other thing to consider is looking at an overall lifestyle change to reduce the challenges upon the body's glutathione detoxification issues so that it can be salvaged and then more available. And, I think that that's not really in the general purview of a neurologist to look at an individual's lifestyle and really ask the question, what kind of exposures are you having? Is there manganese exposure in your life? Are you, exposed to volatile organic compounds, various types of cleaning solutions? Is there any risk of heavy metal? And let's check for heavy metals. Let's check for manganese, for example, that we see elevated in the blood of some Parkinson's patients. We know that welders and other individuals involved in exposure to manganese, mining, for example, have a significant increased risk. There's a lot been written about something called trichloroethylene, TCE, which is an industrial solvent. In fact, I had the opportunity to interview really one of the leaders in this understanding, Dr. Ray Dorsey, a neurologist, who's written a book, I happen to have it here, called Ending Parkinson's Disease. And what the subtitle is a prescription for action, i.e., yes, there are things to do that can reduce risk on the patient level and on the population level as well. I am suspicious that microplastic exposure may increase risk. So, these are things that when we are able to manage them, or at least give people the tools, our hope is that then we, A, reduce the risk of that exposure leading to this damage or perpetuating the damage, and B, we salvage glutathione's ability to do what it is there to do, and that is help with detoxification.
I imagine, do you know the statistics of numbers of reports of Parkinson? I mean, I imagine it's like many other autoimmune diseases, it's on the rise. I mean, I personally know several people with Parkinson's and none of them have, that I imagine based on what they've done for a living and their lifestyle, have these risk factors that you just mentioned about, manganese and overexposure and whatnot. So,
the world in which we live is toxic.
Yes.
And yes, we are all exposed to volatile organic compounds on a daily basis, like it or not. Yes, we are exposed to microplastics. Yes, we are exposed to endocrine disruptors every, day in and day out. And yes, there is still some exposure to trichloroethylene and other types of solvents that have generally been reduced, if not banned, but remain in the environment. I mean, for a long time, we were seeing perchloroethylene being used to clean our clothes. And that got into the groundwater. It got into the clothes that we got back from the dry cleaner that would outgas this very toxic chemical that, matter of fact, is associated with Parkinson's risk. Maneb and mancozeb are things that are fungicides, insecticides that are strongly related, in fact, used to create Parkinson's in the experimental animal. And they are sold to this day on Amazon as things we should put on our vegetable gardens. I don't make that up.
What about Roundup?
There has been some discussion about the active ingredient in Roundup being glyphosate in terms of being related to Parkinson's risk, that's for sure. But I think that the other thing that is certainly seen to have an association are changes in the milieu, in the diversity and functionality of the bacteria living within the gut. And we know that Roundup, or glyphosate to be specific from a chemical perspective, significantly induces changes within the human microbiome. And are those changes necessarily those changes that are seen in the Parkinson's patients? I don't know that that's necessarily been correlated, but the truth is that, we live in an extremely challenging environment in terms of toxicity, and it's inappropriate to even consider the notion that we have, by virtue of our genome, the production of the detoxification enzymes that can get us through, the exposures to which we are exposed in our modern world. So yes, you may not be, the patient you see who has Parkinson's, he or she may not have been involved in welding or mining manganese, but all the other things I mentioned.
That's what I was leading to, that clearly the list has expanded over the years, right?
That's right.
Of the things that we're being exposed to, and though maybe they're not being exposed to those particular elements, there are more and more chemicals coming on the market every day that are not being thoroughly tested, or they're being tested by the manufacturer of this chemical to prove that it's harmful versus to prove that it's safe, that are coming. And so we are inundated with all kinds of exposures now.
And let's be clear, there is no testing. I mean, there is no reasonable level of safety or sanction given to these new products coming on the market every single day to which we are exposed. And they can be in our shampoos and our, in the soap that we use to clean our dishes, dishwashing packets that are wrapped in plastic that become, microplastics attached to our dishes. So respectfully, it's a toxic world.
The furniture we sit on, the rugs we have, the carpeting,
the clear plastic bottles that we drink our water out of.
Mm-hmm.
So, the notion that we're seeing this incredible increase in incidence in Parkinson's is valid. Have we underestimated the number of cases? Extremely. And I think that's here to stay. I mean, we're going to continue to see, now significant numbers, as much as a million individuals in America may have Parkinson's, and adding 90 to 100,000 annually. It's worrisome. And, that's why we have these discussions, and we hope that people will take something home from what we've talked about. And that is that, yes, there's value in eating organic food. Yes, drink out of a glass bottle as opposed to a clear plastic that are so ubiquitous, or stainless steel for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And, the water you drink matters a whole lot. Eat a diet that's rich in sulfur-based foods to help with detoxification, and foods that are rich in nitrates that help the body produce nitric oxide. Foods that aid in detoxification specifics are the cruciferous vegetables and things like broccoli sprouts to enhance the availability of sulforaphane in the body. That does what? Falls right into the pathway to increase glutathione. You want to increase glutathione? Eat some broccoli sprouts every day. Sprout them yourself or buy them at the health food store. These are ways that we can, while we can't get rid of all the toxins around us, we can improve our ability to deal with them by enhancing our detox pathways, like the glutathione pathway.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to get into what you recommend in addition to that and what you yourself do. Before we get there, you mentioned the microbiome and diversity in the microbiome. So we know, detox pathways are compromised when we're dealing with Parkinson's. You mentioned a link between the microbiome. Are there other root causes that you've seen that go along with Parkinson's? There's a lot of research now.
And we've brought up this so-called gut-brain/brain-gut connection. And there's even research now indicating that a couple of interesting things. First of all, that the accumulation within the brain of something called alpha-synuclein, we talk about how the accumulation in the brain of beta amyloid is related to Alzheimer. So with that as a foundation of these abnormal proteins or misfolded proteins relating to a disease state, similar thing is happening in Parkinson's, and the protein here is called alpha-synuclein. Turns out that the precursors for alpha-synuclein are in the gut, and that they make their way to the brain, quite likely, by hitching a ride on the vagus nerve. And that's fascinating. I mean, you talk about a gut-brain connection. Here's an actual physical connection, the vagus nerve. And the original research that proposed this had to do with, back in the day when somebody had ulcers, we would do a surgery doing what's called a vagotomy and pyloroplasty. In other words, an operation on the pylorus, but also cutting the vagus nerve in hopes of reducing stomach acid. Turns out that back in the day, those individuals who had that vagotomy, or a vagotomy for any other reason, had a pretty significant reduction in Parkinson's risk, relating then this pathway, this vagus nerve pathway back to the brain, as playing a role perhaps in some people with Parkinson's disease. The other thing that has been found is that individuals who have had an appendectomy have a lower risk for Parkinson's. And it's been found that the precursor for this alpha-synuclein protein that accumulates in the Parkinson's brain accumulates in the appendix. So having an appendectomy might be protective as it relates to Parkinson's. Now, you asked what other things may be going on aside from toxic exposure, and I mentioned pugilistic, in other words, being bumped in the head too many times. And these are interesting areas of research that I think are really ultimately may bear fruit in the future in terms of keeping the brain healthy. Now, I'm not suggesting we all have our vagus nerve cut, nor am I suggesting everybody run out and get an appendectomy.
Well, I was just going to say there may be a rise, right? With the women having the mastectomies prophylactically. Are we going to start seeing people having appendectomies prophylactically?
I would say that we've got to be darn sure that appendix isn't doing things that are important for us.
Well, you and I know that it probably is, right?
I would, yeah. It's not there just so that it happens to be something that a doctor can take away when he or she's doing a hysterectomy. Oh, we may as well take your appendix while we're at it. It's a mistake in evolution. It shouldn't be there. I'm not one to believe that. I think that, there have been a lot of ideas put forth in terms of what the appendix does. And one of them is to serve as a reservoir for bacteria should there be something going on in the gut. like, an overwhelming infection or something, and allowing the gut then to repopulate based upon this reservoir. Who knows? But I don't think having wisdom teeth or an appendix is a mistake. It should just be capriciously removed, my opinion.
Totally agree. I wasn't born with wisdom teeth, fun fact. So,
And yet you have all this wisdom.
I know, I'm more evolved. I'm, evolved past the wisdom teeth. Okay, so back to we talked about some root causes, and then I always tell people, the to try to prevent toxins from coming in to begin with. Filter your water, filter your air, have HEPA filters. As you did, eat organic. So, preventing the toxins from coming in and then really working to get them out. You mentioned some of the broccoli sprouts, taking the precursors to glutathione. What's your approach to this in terms of, in general for toxins, but certainly anybody who's concerned about Parkinson's?
Good question. So I have broccoli sprouts most days. I had a broccoli sprout omelet this morning. I do sprout broccoli seeds on rare occasion. I do it more when we're away, like on our boat. But we have great access to broccoli sprouts here in town at the farmer's market. So I just buy them each week. And then taking N-acetylcysteine, alpha lipoic acid, I think very, very important. Limiting exposure. We get 5-gallon glass containers of water. Mountain Valley is the brand. I have no affiliation with them. It could be any other brand, but we know it's a good, safe water. At home, we have all of our water is cleaned by reverse osmosis that we shower in, that we do anything in, we wash our dishes in. Now, this may seem draconian, but I don't want to get one of these problems. I've seen what it's like, and we know these relationships, they're staring us in the face. So, there are certainly many other supplements that I'm involved in taking, but to answer your question specifically, what are we doing to enhance detoxification and limit exposure to toxins? That's central to what we do. There's, the clothes that you wash in the washing machine have residual amounts of soap on them, and you need to consider what that may be. And certainly the use of scented soaps is to be avoided. What you put in the dryer, these pieces of material that then off gas the stuff into your clothes to make them soft or whatever. Oh, it's very, very worrisome. We don't get involved in that.
If I have anybody come over to my house, I remind them we are a scent-free home. Just I can't even tolerate somebody who's washed their clothes and those things, coming into my home, because the scent lingers in your home. Can you imagine, putting that on your body and thinking you're not going to absorb it, but then also you're smelling it all day?
As a segue, I would say that we've got to be cognizant of the exposure of particulate matter that we are now seeing in record amounts, these so-called PM 2.5s. As it relates, for example, to the incredible increase in forest fires, we saw a lot of smoke pollution last year throughout the Northeast and upper Midwest areas as a consequence of huge amounts, 3.5 million acres in Canada that burned last year, with the record previously being, I think, somewhere around 17.5 million acres. So we're going to see that more and more. And let's be clear, this isn't a campfire. We're not busting out the marshmallows. This is, sure, it's woods, but it's also homes with all that toxic material and all kinds of things. Cars are being burned. And
computers, electronics, yes, all of it. We had 2 years ago, I'm in Santa Fe currently, and 2 years ago, we had fires on either side of mountain ranges. And
and now you're in the valley.
Right. And so we have something called a HRV, and we have fresh air coming into our home that's then filtered through a specific HEPA filter. And we also have HEPA filters in the house, but we had to shut off the incoming, because I woke up in the middle of the night and it literally smelled like I had a fire in my house. And this was miles away.
It could be 2,000 miles away. So that's, all of us living in the same closet. And, here were fires in northeastern Canada, and, people were seeing smoke in South Carolina. So, it's a testament to the fact that, we all live on the same planet. We've got to, what affects, that doesn't respect borders. It really lets us know how small our environment really is. We were on a boat in British Columbia, of all places, beautiful, spectacular British Columbia, going along, and we lost vision in the distance because of the smoke. That was the first sign. And I have a portable handheld TM 2.5 detector, and it was telling us that our air was bad. So we had to close up the boat and turn on our HEPA filter in a boat in British Columbia as well. So it doesn't bode well for the future. I mean, the relationship of exposure of these PM 2.5s and Parkinson's risk, I think, is beginning to be explored, but the relationship between these particles and Alzheimer's and dementia, I think, is well substantiated by now. There's been a lot of research in Canada and now in the States that's looking at that. And it stands to reason, because one of the main things that exposure to these particles does is increases inflammation. Interestingly, just last week in the New England Journal of Medicine was a fascinating study that followed individuals. They underwent an operation. A large group of people underwent an operation to clean out the plaque in their carotid artery. They looked at the plaque and they determined, does the plaque that they take out and look in the laboratory contain these microplastics or not? And what they found was that in those individuals in whom they found microplastics in their plaque that they took out of the carotid artery, they followed them over 3.5 years, that they were about 400% increased risk for a major cardiac event.
Wow.
We've got to limit our exposure to these particles in the atmosphere, the PM 2.5s. We've got to limit our exposure to the microplastics to which we are exposed that are in the plastic bottles that contain the water that we drink.
But they're also, I've heard, in our food supply now. So we can stop drinking out of plastic bottles. We can eliminate plastic from our home. I mean, you can virtually do that. But how do you eat in the world?
Well, you buy food at the periphery of the grocery store that isn't packed in plastic. That's very straightforward. It's, we know that many of these things like bisphenol A are in the plastic, and it does impart itself into the food that's in the plastic. Go to farmers markets. They pick the food, they put it out, and you buy it and bring it home and wash it.
Right. But what about, I've heard reports just because of the plastics in the ocean, right? That then it's now in our salmon supply, not farm salmon, in our wild salmon, because it's in our ocean.
It's very, very challenging. I mean, I don't want to sound so pessimistic, but you are right. It's a very, very worrisome world in which we live. That's a given. Okay, I get it. And now what are you going to do about it? And, what you and I are doing right now are giving people tools with the understanding that the world is threatening about what we can do to mitigate risk, or at least minimize risk, and also enhance our ability to, when we are exposed, to deal with that exposure and help our bodies rid themselves of these chemicals, if that's at all possible. Ridding our bodies of microplastics is a challenge. I can't indicate, where we would begin that process. So I think that's going to fall on the side of limiting exposure, which is not 100% something that we can do.
Yeah, I tell people, do it in your home, because I travel. I want to see the world. I have to travel for work. You're going to go out and you can't control it as much there.
Yeah, the scented Christmas tree in the Uber. When you get an Uber.
Oh, God. I have a whole list when I travel, right?
That's true. Those are the volatile organic compounds that we've got to avoid.
Yeah. No, Uber, no air freshener.
And you can't request an Uber without the air freshener. That's not a thing.
One of the things you said made me think, when we were talking about these microplastics, is there anything else that you personally do in your toolbox, or that you recommended to your patients as an adjunct besides the supplements, the foods, the filtered water, like infrared sauna to help with detoxification? I
think for detoxification, enhancing that via near, medium, and far infrared sauna is the way to go. I was in my sauna just 20 hours ago, and that there's a lot to be said beyond even detoxification. But I have what's called a sunlightened sauna, and we are exposed to near infrared at, I think it's 680 nanometers. And, that actually penetrates and is able to serve as an enhancement in terms of mitochondrial function. So I'm all in as it relates to that.
We started to kind of segue into Alzheimer's, which of course is another expertise of yours. And you mentioned, these microplastics and many of the toxins, frankly, I guess, that are leading to to Parkinson's can also lead to Alzheimer's. Can you talk to us about what you've seen?
Certainly. And I would say that the relationship of Alzheimer's to toxic exposure is far less revealed or documented than it is with Parkinson's. I mean, I think what's clear as it relates to Alzheimer's, and this is actually a foot up, gives us a point of leverage, is that fundamentally it represents a change in the metabolism of the brain. That's the harbinger to later on both the clinical decline as well as the accumulation of beta amyloid protein. In mainstream medicine, there's incredible efforts to target that beta amyloid, but that's a far down the line issue as it relates to the chronology of what's going on in the Alzheimer's brain. Step one are changes in metabolism throughout the body, including the brain. And specifically, what is metabolism? It's the way that cells utilize fuel to make energy. And as such, that's dependent upon good function of the mitochondria. The stage is set for future development of Alzheimer's when the body's metabolism is disrupted 2 or 3 decades prior to the memory beginning to fail, to the executive function becoming compromised. So, the notion of we're going to wait until somebody begins to fail in their memory and report to the clinic and then give them this injection that's going to cost, $40,000 to $60,000 a year with a significant associated risk with the hopes of slowing their decline. I appreciate that's the approach that some people think is valuable, and I guess it is. Doesn't work for me. My mission is to let people know that, again, the seeds are sown for brain degeneration 2, 3, 4 decades in advance. And here's what you need to be doing right now to keep brain metabolism where it needs to be, and therefore dramatically lower your risk for this disease, for which, did I mention, there is no meaningful treatment.
Is there a test, a study, a brain scan, anything that you can do, 20, 30 years ahead of time if you're even concerned about it, or you have a family risk factors? Or
there are a variety of things people should be looking at. One of the most difficult and sophisticated and expensive things a person can do is to go out and buy what's called a tape measure. Put it around your waist. That will give you a sense as to your Alzheimer's risk right now if you're 30 years old. So my point is that when we're compromising our metabolism, we're setting the stage for Alzheimer's. That being said, be great to know your fasting blood sugar, even better, your fasting insulin level, even better, wear a continuous glucose monitor that as of a week ago were approved for non-prescription availability. Can you imagine letting anybody who wants to know what their glucose metabolism is like to have that information at any given moment? The pillars are to make sure your metabolism is good, your blood sugar is where it needs to be, that insulin is working, that you haven't raised your body weight, and that finally you're getting enough physical exercise 6 days a week and you're sleeping well. There are lots of other things, being socially interactive, spending time in nature, minimizing stress, meditation, all those other things. But the main things are keeping your blood sugar under control, getting a good night's sleep, and exercising. I think that's probably a 50% reduction right now. And I pull that number out of the hat because no one's actually done a specific study of those. But we do see now retrospective studies that look at, for example, physical activity. One study published in JAMA measured the number of steps a large group of people in England took on a daily basis, and it followed these individuals for, I think, 8.5 years and found a significant risk reduction in those people who walked at least 10,000 or took at least 10,000 steps in a given day. That said, more than just walking, the whole notion of being off your rear end, in other words, reducing sedentarity, the value of resistance exercise, and even perhaps looking at things like high intensity interval training, or HIIT. These things are all really valuable. We now understand that muscles are an endocrine organ, right there with things like the pituitary and the pancreas and the adrenals, that the muscles are producing by definition of an endocrine gland, chemicals that have activity elsewhere in the body, and they do. One of the key things that muscles produce is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, tonic for the brain, miracle grow for the brain. Every time you're stressing your muscles by virtue of exercise, you're creating a chemical that's enhancing the health of your neurons and actually stimulating your brain to grow new neurons. You talk about an Alzheimer's offset. That's exactly what you want to do when faced with a disease in which the neurons and the synapses are declining. Here is a way to repopulate and enhance, for example, the synapses, the way cells are connecting to each other.
So in your experience, have you seen that Alzheimer's can be reversed? Sounds like it can be prevented. Well, I didn't really ask that about Parkinson's. Have you seen it be reversed, or is it just a matter of?
We have seen new research that's showing patients having a reduction in symptoms. I've never seen in my life a Parkinson's cure, but there's pretty incredible, innovative work being done to actually target the disease, not just treat the symptoms. Let me be clear, I'm all for the symptomatic treatment of diabetes, of high blood pressure, and Parkinson's. People have to be able to get around and reduce their tremor and rigidity and be able to be functional. Totally get that. I'm all in, provided that there's no harm done. Medications are one thing, deep brain stimulation, putting an electrode in somebody's brain, effective, but it's certainly, I think we'd all agree, a lot more aggressive. But that said, new innovations are taking place. I think our glutathione protocol was really exciting, but we're now seeing what is called photomodulation therapy, where people are exposed to two frequencies of red light, 670 nanometers and I think 810, which penetrates the skull and enhances mitochondrial function, and seeing dramatic improvements in Parkinson's. How that's going to play for their long-term time course in terms of decline is unclear. But I think that's targeting the underlying fundamental problem, which is a mitochondrial issue. And, frankly, an immunological issue too. And those are not disparate. That mitochondrial dysfunction in the neuron relates to the immune system, because we know that this mitochondrial dysfunction is well beyond the neuron in the brain, that it involves as well, and this is an interesting story. There's a story I'll tell you in a moment, but it involves as well some of the brain's immune cells called microglia. And when these microglial cells in the brain have their mitochondrial function compromised, they are able to shift from being helpful to harmful, become the evil twin, if you will, and allow and even enhance the accumulation of misfolded proteins and increase the production of inflammatory chemicals within the brain. I want to get back to something because this is the perfect segue to it. I had mentioned that in the early 1980s, there was this group of individuals who were exposed to MPTP and developed Parkinson's. It's illicit drug, a type of Demerol. And a study appeared, I think it was 10 years later, in the journal Neurology, where one of them had died, and they were able to look at that individual's brain in the area of the brain involved in Parkinson's. And what they found in that, the micrographs that they published were breathtaking for me, because yes, there was dropout of neurons in the dopamine part of the brain, the substantia nigra, but there was a continuing, ongoing inflammatory increase in the microglial cells that had been damaged ostensibly 10 years prior, but the inflammation cascade was continuing in this individual lifelong, meaning that once there's this damage, it creates this cycle whereby the problem continues. We've seen the same thing in the story related to this CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the ongoing continued damage of the brains in football players long since retired. The instigating event had stopped, but the process of brain damage continues. We saw it with Muhammad Ali, didn't box anymore, and yet continued his downward spiral with his Parkinson's. And this is a worrisome issue that is actually quite common as it relates to the brain. We're seeing continued decline in brain function in people post-COVID, for example, when there's been an insult to the brain. What's causing it, we don't know. But we do know that when immune cells in the brain are activated by any number of mitochondrial threats, that their continued activity that is now pro-inflammatory can continue lifelong and can lead to progressive decline in brain function.
I was going to ask you about your thoughts about, Bruce Willis and Wendy Williams with this frontal lobe.
There may be an ongoing insult.
Right.
My sense is, though, that there might not be. My sense is that there have been insults, plural, in those who are genetically predisposed. We know that's the case with frontotemporal dementia, that then set things into motion.
Mm-hmm.
And, so what I'm saying is these damaging events to the brain they may not be one-offs, but they don't need to be, ongoing to continue the perpetration of the crime against the brain. And, that said, an exposure or series of exposures to a chemical long ago can set the stage for this feed-forward cycle, like we talked about with the MPTP people who developed flagrant Parkinsonism and continued to decline even after the exposure had happened. We see that with the manganese individuals exposures, the DDT exposures, and again, we see it with head trauma and these CTE professional athletes, and like boxers, like football players, for example. So the mission then is to recognize that the mitochondria have been threatened, that the whole notion of mitochondrial function is threatened, and all of the issues with respect to mitochondria, we're beginning to understand how we can work to create programs to improve their function and improve the mitochondria themselves. And how do we do that? Well, the first thing that has to happen, we have to enhance what's called mitophagy. We have to enhance our ability to rid the body, and in this case, the brain, of defective mitochondria. And there's a built-in process for that already there. We just want to do what we can to enhance it. So we have this ability to clear cellular debris, the damaged cellular components, more broadly called autophagy or self-eating. But as it relates to mitochondria, we call it mitophagy. And how can we enhance it? Well, we know that exercise does it. Anytime we can activate certain pathways of metabolism in the body, like something called the AMP kinase pathway, which we can activate by fasting, by physical exercise. Certain medications like metformin act in this way. We know that rapamycin and rapalogs can also enhance mitophagy, that we are enhancing the way the body clears these defective mitochondria. The problem is, and why there's ongoing perpetration of the damage, is that when mitochondria have been damaged, they replicate and form new damaged mitochondria. The daughter mitochondria are also defective. And that's the reason that we see that these problems continue over time. But we can activate this mitophagy, identify those mitochondria through activation of things called PINK1 Parkin pathway that can allow our bodies to rid themselves of these damaged mitochondria. And then what happens is we then enhance what's called mitochondrial biogenesis, the creation of new, better functioning mitochondria. And again, we do that through the techniques that I've just mentioned, through fasting, through exercise, through drugs that target AMP kinase, through limiting uric acid, for example, levels in the body, through the use of various medications that can enhance mitochondrial biogenesis. One of the best things we can do is exercise. That is key. That activates this AMP kinase pathway and allows these good things to happen.
Well, that's another good segue, talking about the uric acid in your most recent, although it's not that recent book, Drop Acid. Do you want to talk to us briefly about that and the concepts with the uric acid?
Well, let's see if I can build the segue a little bit. So we're talking about how, I'm going to back into the uric acid story.
Okay.
How we can amplify AMP kinase. And it turns out that AMP kinase has an evil twin, and it's called AMP deaminase. And it really does pretty much the opposite of things that AMP kinase does. when AMP deaminases. We're talking about enzymes that break down AMP. AMP is adenosine monophosphate. It's the end product of energy utilization. When ATP, our energy currency, is utilized, ultimately ADP and adenosine diphosphate, and then the AMP, adenosine monophosphate produced. How do you deal with it? Well, it goes down the AMP kinase pathway. That's good. It tells our body that we don't need to store fat. We can use a lot of energy because energy is plentiful. We don't need to make more blood sugar from the liver through gluconeogenesis. All good things. But when the evil twin is activated, AMP deaminase, it tells our body that there is an energy shortage. It tells our body that we've got to go into a state of physiology to preserve calories, locking up the utilization of fat, reducing mitochondrial function so we burn less calories, and amping up, that's perfect, amping up the production of sugar in the body through production of sugar in the liver, gluconeogenesis, because we need it to power the brain so we can avoid starvation and predation, being eaten. So what is it then that determines whether we're going to go down the path of AMP kinase, good, or AMP deaminase, bad? It's uric acid. And this is your grandfather's uric acid, where we've talked about it only in the context of gout. But it turns out that uric acid is a central player in regulating human metabolism as a survival mechanism. Yes, if we are starving, uric acid does its wonder for us and increases our fat storage, and as well as our ability to make blood sugar to power the brain. Fat storage is a wonderful thing to have on board when we are facing starvation, or we know starvation is coming, or our physiology knows it, like in the wintertime, or facing dehydration. Remember that fat is a hedge against dehydration. Who knew? If you look at the camel, and it has its hump on the back that allows it to cross the desert without drinking water, it's a hump that's full of fat, because when camels and you and I metabolize fat, we produce two things: carbon dioxide and water, physiological water. We're making water within our bodies. So therefore, yet another reason that making fat is a survival mechanism. But we don't need to make more fat these days. Food is abundant. We don't need to raise our blood sugar through gluconeogenesis. We don't need to raise our blood pressure, which is another thing that elevated uric acid does. And it does so through the inhibition of something called nitric oxide. So nitric oxide, a gas in the body that has two fundamental roles. And number one is it regulates blood flow to the brain, to the kidneys, throughout the body. We need nitric oxide to keep the blood vessels open. Let me digress for a moment. There is a situation in males in which blood flow doesn't happen as well as it should. It's called erectile dysfunction. That's a blood flow issue. So drugs have been developed, like Viagra, to raise nitric oxide, what I've been talking about, to increase blood flow, in this case, to help with erectile dysfunction. That's what nitric oxide does, in addition to facilitating how insulin works to keep our blood sugar under control. So nitric oxide is a very important player in keeping our metabolism where it needs to be. And guess what? Higher levels of uric acid suppress nitric oxide. And therefore, having a high uric acid, because it compromises nitric oxide, higher uric acid level is associated with higher blood sugar, higher risk for diabetes or prediabetes as well, higher blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, and even dementia. Because face it, the brain requires the use of blood sugar, insulin, and the brain requires blood flow. So, yet another reason to keep your uric acid where it needs to be. One study that was done in Japan looked at individuals who had uric acid either in the normal range or above 7. And it found that those individuals who had a high uric acid level were 4 times more likely to demonstrate cognitive impairment. Based on being studied at a given moment, we'll compare your uric acid level with your performance on a cognitive study. That's worrisome. And just to put it into perspective of lifestyle, where does most of the uric acid in humans come from? Back in the day, we were told that in treating a gout patient, you had to put them on a low purine diet. Remember that?
Yeah. I think they still do tell people that.
Mainstream clinics online recommendations, they say, low purine diet and limit alcohol.
Right.
Those are not the big players as it relates to uric acid. The biggest issue in our modern world that correlates perfectly with increasing uric acid levels since the 1920s is sugar. Fructose in particular. Fructose, which is 50% of table sugar, is metabolized directly into something called uric acid. Fructose consumption raises uric acid. We're living in a society where people are eating around 110 pounds of sugar a year. So
crazy.
And so here we are consuming the precursor to uric acid, raising our uric acids dramatically, and then wondering why is it metabolic diseases like diabetes, obesity, and hypertension are exploding around the world? Well, it's related to strangely, what we eat. Who knew? Not that we are Ozempic deficient or whatever. It's because we're eating the precursor uric acid. It's telling our bodies winter is coming, store fat, and increase blood sugar. As a primitive survival mechanism that, was part of our evolution 8 million years ago during a time of primate food scarcity, the middle Miocene period when the earth was cold. So this genetic mutation happened over a couple of million years that turned out to be a survival advantage during times of food scarcity. We are all deficient human beings across the planet in the enzyme that breaks down uric acid called uricase. So we have much higher levels of uric acid in comparison to other mammals, for example, because it was a survival mechanism that is now confronted by our environment in which food seems to be abundant, and particularly foods that raise blood sugar and are higher in fructose.
So let me ask you, I'm familiar with testing for uric acid, being in the ER, wondering if somebody has gout. Is the reference range the proper range that you're looking for, or is within that there a more optimal range? If
I don't like
7,
I don't like in the normal range.
Of
nor
course.
do you. Yeah, you and I love optimal range. Normal is average, and people that listen to Amy Myers know that you are not about average. You're about optimal. You're about being the best person you can be in any domain. And as it relates to uric acid, the so-called cutoff for the normal value is 7 milligrams per deciliter. That does not work. We want 5.5 or lower.
Less. Okay.
Because we see even levels above 5.5 now are related to risk for the various diseases that we talked about. So, most of the studies look at 7 milligrams per deciliter, seeing that, for example, in one study that was published back in 2017, a fairly large study that showed that people above 7, and to me that's a very high level, that risk for hypertension was increased by about 15%, just in relation to having that higher level of uric acid. And, another study similarly showed that, I think it was 1,200 individuals, that those who had levels above 7 had like an 83% increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, and about 160% increased risk of what is called mixed or vascular dementia. So, these numbers are very real. And, I put out those numbers in the context of, again, keep in mind that we don't have a treatment for that problem once it begins. And that's unfortunate. Again, I would welcome the development of a drug to treat and reverse Alzheimer's. And to be fair, I'm heading up research that will begin, we're hoping in the next 6 months, an interventional trial in existing Alzheimer's patients using a treatment that will increase their nitric oxide and therefore hopefully increase brain metabolism, the blood supply and the utilization of glucose in the brain by virtue of our ability to increase nitric oxide.
That was literally going to be my next question, which is how do we do that? So obviously you want to minimize the things that are going to increase your uric acid And then you want to maximize things that can increase your nitric oxide. I just recently interviewed our friend Frank Lippman, and he was talking about Viagra in low dosages, not the dose being used for erectile dysfunction. So I don't know if you have any experience with that. And then what other things, I don't know if you can speak to your current research or if there are other things out there to.
A new study came out on Viagra, and I'm not sure that that's the way I'd want to go as an intervention as relates to, but I think the notion of increasing nitric oxide is important. But let's unpack that just for a moment and recognize that about 50% of the nitric oxide in your body is manufactured via a pathway that involves the oral microbiome, meaning that, well, let me unpack it a little bit, that nitrate in our foods that are rich in nitrate, like colorful vegetables, specifically beets. It's why people take beet-related compounds, that those nitrates are converted into nitrite by virtue of various Rothia, Neisseria, actinomyces bacteria that live on the top of the tongue. And that nitrite then serves as the raw material from which our bodies can make nitric oxide. And that's where about 50% of the nitric oxide in the body comes from. So two things are important there. First, you want to eat nitrate-rich foods like colorful vegetables and specifically beets. And second, you want to make sure you're not damaging those bacteria that live in your mouth. Two interesting studies have been published recently, and they're very interesting. And I think they raise eyebrows as I present these studies when I lecture. And they both involved following people for about a 3-year period of time and stratifying the population in terms of their use of antibacterial mouthwash. They showed that in those who use mouthwash 2 or more times a day, there was a 50% increase risk of diabetes, and I think an 83% risk of hypertension after 3 years. And what are the two things that nitric oxide does are controlling insulin and allowing blood vessels to relax, hence the use of Viagra for erectile dysfunction. So this is not, this is just showing this relationship. But again, the message being that we've got to cater to our oral microbiome. So much is written and talked about as it relates to the gut microbiome, and certainly incredibly important, that's for sure. We touched upon it earlier. But now we're beginning to see that the things we're doing to our oral microbiome are really important as well. And, the mouthwash commercials would have you believe that the mouth bacteria should be considered germs. And that's obviously negative. And the reality is that controlling our blood pressure is seen to be one of the influences of our oral microbiome. We've seen research now that simply increasing the availability of a nitrate in the mouth has led to a reduction in blood pressure in a couple of studies. Think about that. So, yeah, I think that the idea of salvaging nitric oxide is really very important. One very valuable tool to increase nitric oxide is called exercise. Who knew? But exercise targets nitric oxide formation. Lowering your uric acid allows nitric oxide to be functional. It turns out that the ability of nitric oxide to do its job that relates to insulin involves estradiol, a hormone, a form of estrogen, and that the ultimate then utilization of this nitric oxide is to some degree dependent upon testosterone. So a lot of things to unpack that are related, but to consider. But all the work that we do with respect to hormones, et cetera, it all comes into play. And it's a comprehensive understanding of human physiology and pathophysiology as well.
Back to the dental, I'm a huge proponent of making your own toothpaste just with, baking soda and hydrogen peroxide. And, the only time I've ever used those mouthwashes is in the height of COVID, when there was some research about, doing the nasal washes, and then that some of the mouthwashes could potentially kill the virus. So
now that you recognize how important preserving your oral microbiome is in terms of your metabolism, and understanding that who had the worst outcome from COVID were people who had metabolic issues like diabetes and obesity.
Absolutely.
So you want to preserve your metabolism. Therefore, using that, that's the downside then of using the oral mouthwash. Having said that, there are a couple of products that are out there now that tend to
They help preserve your microbiome in your mouth.
I was getting to coating the nasal passages to reduce the ability of viruses, via the droplet to make their way. And ultimately become infectious. So, there are a lot of good lessons that we've gotten from this COVID experience. A devastating experience, but it really, it brought on a lot of curiosity from a lot of people, and I think some, very forward-thinking people are involved, especially not just in the way that the virus took root and was transmitted, but even now as it relates to the mitochondrial issues of long COVID. I think, it's devastating, but some good will come out of it that I think we'll be able to use in other diseases.
I was doing an interview with David Brady, and we were talking about how with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, these went so unrecognized for so many years through the conventional, medical community. Yet with long COVID, they really identified that right away and, placed a name on it. And now there is a lot of funding, even in conventional medicine, to really figure out what that's about. And I'm sure they'll be looking for a drug, but really how we can reverse those effects.
Yeah, there was an article that came out in Neurology Reviews probably 3 weeks ago that was talking about the crossover between fibromyalgia and long COVID, and mentioned the idea of if we can enhance mitochondrial function via what I mentioned, the AMP kinase pathway, then maybe this will have some play in both of those entities, and actually talked about using metformin, a diabetes drug, which we know activates AMP kinase, as proposed that as a way of increasing mitochondrial activity via turning on mitophagy or the ridding of the body of these damaged mitochondria.
Final question. Have you seen, I'm a huge proponent of hyperbaric oxygen. Have you used that in, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, or just even your current research?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I will meet in a couple of weeks with a company called Aviv, AVIV, that has a huge hyperbaric center in Orlando, and the medical director, that Dr. Shai Efrati, MD, is doing research in Israel here in the States as well. Met with him in New York last month. So I think that it is absolutely worthy of deep exploration. The results he's getting right now in terms of a stroke patient, for example, I think is profound. And I think we've just connected him with a company called ME-Scan that does mitochondrial blood assessment. And I think we're going to be working on a protocol to use that blood study of mitochondrial function in patients undergoing hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And I think we're going to demonstrate that this is a powerful tool for enhancing mitochondrial function. That's a home run for me. I've been targeting mitochondrial function ever since we began seeing patients with chronic Lyme disease. So that's an awful long time.
I have seen incredible results with hyperbarics. And, personally, I had some post-COVID significant fatigue. I was worried it was going to turn into long COVID, and I got in the hyperbaric. Of course, I got in it when I actively had COVID, and then I stopped, and then got in it a couple sessions, and my fatigue went right away.
Yeah. I have hyperbaric scheduled for next week, as a matter of fact.
I'm literally between my next appointment, I think I'm going to go get in my machine. So
there you go.
All right. Well, this has been incredible. Appreciate everything you do. One of the questions I like to ask all guests is 3 things that you'd recommend our listeners could do right away to take back their health.
First would be to have a gratitude journal and to write down each day at whatever point of the day seems best, some things for which you are grateful. The next thing is dedicate yourself to physical exercise. I would buy a product that can measure your sleep quality and quantity and make sure you're getting enough restorative sleep. And if you're not, finding out why not. And I'm a huge proponent in understanding your blood sugar, and therefore a continuous glucose monitor I think is really helpful.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And how can people find you these days?
I would say the best place is drperlmutter.com, drperlmutter.com. I do Instagram posts very, very frequently. My podcast is called The Empowering Neurologist. That's available on Apple, and we post to YouTube. It goes out to a lot of resources. But I think the clearinghouse is drperlmutter.com.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate your time. And speaking of gratitude, I'm very grateful for you and paving the way for those of us that came behind you in functional medicine. So thank you for all your work and everything that you've done.
You bet. Thank you, Amy. So good to see you again.
I want to thank this week's guests for sharing their time and knowledge, and thank you for listening. To read the full show notes for each episode, which include a summary, timestamp, quotes, and any resources mentioned, please visit amymyersmd.com/podcasts. Lastly, if you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love if you would leave a rating and a review on Apple or Spotify, and we'll select a few to read out loud in a future episode. Tune in next week to hear from another inspiring guest as we help you take back your health.